For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Mali. Author and journalist Marianne Thamm joins me to discuss her book, Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me. Tell us about your life growing up and your parentage.
I'm the daughter of immigrant parents who came to South Africa in the 1960s. So I was born in England, and my mother was Portuguese and a cleaner for English people, and she was illiterate. So I think I must be the only white South African whose mother was a cleaner and who's illiterate, and it was very interesting. And my dad was German, and he was a prisoner of war after the war. And I think that it was quite a traumatic period for Europe, so people got married very quickly, but they came here because my father had work here, and I grew up in a segregated neighbourhood in Pretoria in terms of just not only racially segregated, but segregated in terms of white culture. So we were seen as immigrants and a threat, and surrounded by quite hostile Afrikaans children, which of course is quite fun for you when you're young, because they're a rival, you know. But you also pick up very quickly that something's not okay in the country, particularly then. And I think Hendrik Verwoerd was the Prime Minister or the President. And I'd always found myself to be a child who was highly aware of what was going on, partly because the children who surrounded me said things about my mother which they disliked. And so I was aware that there were degrees of difference.
How did you end up becoming a journalist?
Well, I think it had to do with the fact that I kind of thought when I was growing up that I wanted to tell the truth, whatever that truth might be, and that was what I felt was surrounding me, that I wasn't reading anywhere. I finished matric. There weren't many places. There wasn't money for me to study, so I went to the Technikon in Pretoria, which was at that time, it's now I think University of Technology in Tshwane. It was like Standard 11. It was like a really basic course. But I've always been curious. I've always been curious about other people. I've been curious about the world that I live in. So I think I'm temperamentally quite suited to the job. And I'm quite tenacious as well. And I wanted to be able to bear witness to what I thought was happening, and indeed found out was happening. So I got a job at the Cape Times eventually. I interned at the Cape Times and then ended up working. That was 1982. So that's how I got into it, and I worked at the Cape Times for a very long time in the 80s, which was a very important time in South Africa's history, very violent time. I was 21 when I started working, and stayed there for the whole of the 80s. So that's where I started. And starting off in a newsroom like that gave me a very good basis for various different beats and for learning how to be very patient, learning how to be in extremely uncomfortable circumstances without cell phones, with typewriters and call boxes. I mean, it's just unthinkable. If I think about it now, it's like that whole thing plays off in black and white, like it's like, you know, in another era. But that's how it started.
Your book is, according to you, a memoir of sorts. Why is this?
Well, because I think if you look at the title, it's Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me. And so those leaders, although I hate to group Mandela with Verwoerd and Hitler, have a very integral, they play an integral part in shaping, I think, history shapes who we are, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. So the book is not only about my personal history, but it's about the political history of what damaged my father as a German. I could have put Salazar in the title, because Salazar was the Portuguese dictator that dominated my mother's life, but Portuguese people responded to fascism with silence, because Salazar's regime was incredibly violent, the same as the South African regime. So it's a memoir of sorts, because in between that family history are a whole lot of ridiculous observations I've made of the 20th century, including advertisements which are absurd, which I pointed out, you know, the sexism, the racism, and I almost held on to those physical reminders of that part because I thought it was wrong. So I'm vindicated because now I can say, you see, I was right. They're wrong. And I love the country and I love the world I live in, because I think that we're so much more humane, so much more conscious, so much more aware of what is right and what is wrong. We're not there yet, we never will be as human beings, but we certainly live in a world which is much more aware of intersectionality, of oppression, of poverty, and of what is wrong and what we must try and fix.
Was there a specific reason you decided to write a memoir?
No, I hate to sound churlish. I didn't want to write a memoir at all. I prefer to write other people's stories. That's what you do as a journalist. But I have a very good friend who's a writer in Belgium who I met when I was there at one point, when I went there to work and do other things. I met him and he's like my brother in a way. A soul brother, and he's a writer and a very well-known writer, and he won a prize I think 2 years ago, and came to see me in South Africa and said, I want you to write your story. I think it's important, and I think the political history and Europe itself at the moment is, I think, going through a particularly interesting time. If you look at Brexit, I think there's a shutting down of the European mind. I think there's a return to the nation states. And as a politically engaged European, I really find it interesting to talk to him because he's really in the thick of it. And he felt that there was an opportunity to look at how you can move through fascism and dictatorship into democracy in one generation. And so he said, listen, write the book. And then a while later I was interviewed for something else entirely, which had to do with my work at the Daily Maverick. And Marie Levita interviewed me and wrote a very beautiful interview, very astute and insightful interview. And the publisher read it. And it was about my father dying and my being there with him. And she said, we want that book. And I thought, I can't, like, the universe is saying something. There's no way I can actually, when everybody's standing on the sideline cheering and saying, write this book, say no. So I thought, well, the best I can do is just try and see. And let's see what comes of it. Let's see what happens. So that's how it happened, because there wasn't really, because I think most people have a story to tell, and all of us have a story that I think other people will find traction with, because there are many similarities in all our lives and many differences. And storytelling is how we make sense of ourselves and the world we live in.
In your book, you write that it had become increasingly difficult to view your father outside the context of World War II. Can you elaborate on this and how it affected your relationship with him?
Well, I think what it did was, I think when people are trapped within particularly virulent and toxic political systems, like fascism in particular, which shapes their every thought and their internal architecture and being. And when I began to watch The World at War, which was the series about the Second World War, and saw the Holocaust and the full impact of that, and when you're part of a perpetrating class, which white South Africans are as well, my question is, what gives somebody a political conscience? What makes some people say, I don't agree with something, I'm not going along with it, at great cost to themselves, often loss of their family, loss of their home, loss of everything, to not go along with the tide, to not benefit from a system. And I couldn't see my father as George. I saw my father as a German who had been part of a bigger system that had done something terrible in that in Europe in the Second World War. And I wanted to get to the bottom of why. Why didn't our family say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen? And in 1938, I don't know if you know, it was like Kristallnacht. That was the night that they burnt the synagogues in Berlin. And my father grew up in Berlin. And I said to him, well, what did you think when you saw those synagogues burning? And he said, I was just a boy on a bicycle. So he was a young boy, but still, even that, you know, there are people like, you know, who, like Ruth First and various other white South Africans who resisted the system, who went into exile, Joe Slovo and others. So the book also examines, in a way, what gives somebody a political conscience, what makes you hang out now, particularly in the 21st century, spending money in a shopping centre and eating expensive food when there's somebody starving at a traffic light. And does it matter? And do you want to make a difference and change the way the world is? So eventually, as I got older and began to realize that I myself will be viewed as part of a greater group of people, white South Africans, who are perpetrators to a certain extent, and who themselves will say they're not. But I'm individual, my father worked hard, we didn't do this, we didn't do that. The point is, you have to go back and look, and logically and from a rational point of view, see what it meant, how it benefited you. So as I grew up, I might have been a woman, an immigrant child, a lesbian, in a country that didn't accept any of those things, but the overarching thing that identified me and that benefited me was the color of my skin, and that matters. But eventually I began to separate the politics from the person, and ultimately that's what we need to do. How much of who we are is our culture, our religion, the politics of the time, the social mores, what other people are telling us how we must feel towards others and be in the world. And it's only when you get to my age that you can go back and say, that's not me. That you told me that, but that's not true. That's wrong. This is okay. I'll take this back. So you reassemble yourself. You take what you've been given and you look at it. And we now live in a world and a time when that's possible, when you are exposed to other points of view. And you can learn from all those points of view and reconstruct a view of the world which is more humane, more decent. But I'm not sure if we make use of those opportunities, because at a certain point we get distracted by television and consumption and the pretty things, the baubles and the beads.
You write in your book that you never really had to come out to your parents about being a lesbian. Why was this?
Well, I kind of didn't, I thought it would be awkward, and it really didn't bother me whether they knew or didn't know. And so I lived a life away from them that they had no understanding of, and I thought, why traumatize them? I didn't feel it was like a burning need for them to know, because it would just cause an issue. I think today it's much easier, but I still do think it's difficult for gay people to come out to their parents, and often I think children who've got very close relationships to their parents, unlike me, although I loved my parents very much, I was very free. I mean, they kind of really didn't get involved in how we were raised. We were quite feral, running around this neighbourhood, which was quite nice, but also not so good. I mean, my children don't go anywhere without me being there. They don't even sleep over anywhere. But I just think my sense of self wasn't completely bound up in that didn't define entirely who I am. And it still doesn't, but it's a very important part of who I am. But back then, I was classified as being mentally ill. So you don't want to say to your parents, hey, by the way, look, in this book, I'm this thing that is mentally ill. So I thought, well, I'll just live it. They don't have to know. It doesn't matter. I don't care if they don't meet the people I love. And besides which, at that age, you don't want to introduce your parents to the person you're seeing romantically. So I kind of enjoyed it, and ultimately, what is there must become known. So in the end, they did know.
You leave South Africa at one point and write that regardless of your political beliefs, you embodied white South Africa to those who encountered you. Can you expand on this?
Yes, because I think when you're living in the middle of something and a part of it, and even if you're a journalist writing about it and want to align yourself with the forces that are good, so you want to align yourself with the struggle, you think you're writing about that struggle, the minute you arrive in Europe or in North America, people see you as the embodiment of the oppressor. And, you aren't called out for that in the country where you're part of that class. And suddenly when I was in Germany, a guy walked into the room and he was like a really radical left-wing guy, which was great, but he was my age. And the minute he found out I was a white South African, he left the room. He said, I'm not going to sit in the same room as you. You're a fascist. And then I said to him, but actually you'd make a really good white South African. And he said, why? And I said, because you've judged me by the color of my skin. But he was right. I have to bear that burden because I was part of that class. And then in Canada, it was a bit funnier because I went to this Halloween party in Canada and I didn't have a costume because, what is Halloween? And I went as a white South African, which was like a pretty frightening thing to be. So I was challenged for the first time around identity politics in Europe as being part of a perpetrating class. And I couldn't get away with saying, yeah, but like I'm involved in the struggle because people didn't care. So they saw me like I saw my dad as part of something bigger. And it was up to me to suck it up and deal with it, actually, because black people are constantly asked where you're from, who you're from. I was never asked that before. I always sort of, in a sense, profiled and needing to explain, whereas white people don't. They move through the world as, white people, not a race, the default. But these are really good questions that we are working through in the world at the moment. It's happening in the United States, but it's really happening in South Africa, where I think white South Africans are very blessed to be a minority. It's a really great position to be in.
Tell us about the incident where you took photographs of protesters on a beach in the Cape and was reprimanded by your editor at the time.
Quis Vivius, long time ago. It was I think in 1985, 96, the second Defiance campaign, and at that point it had been building up for the year. And the protest was that people were going to descend en masse to segregated beaches in Cape Town and I think all over the country. And this was at Blouberg Beach. I was at that point working in the arts department after having sort of worked for many years in the newsroom. And it was a really good time to be in the arts department because people like John Carney and others were starting to do protest theatre. So that was really great. But that particular day I'd been part of the protest and I had a little Instamatic camera, plastic Instamatic camera, and I was taking pictures. And there was this group of people standing on the beach, with our hands up, and in the background this beautiful, iconic backdrop of the mountain. But the police just laid into the crowd with their shamboks. They took the cameras away from the press photographers, who were quite obvious because they had big, cameras, and they could, and ripped the film out. And because I'm a journalist, my instinct was to get back to the newsroom as quickly as possible because I had captured this on film. But somebody who worked with me, I had spotted him on a dune further up the road, not part of the protest, but watching this on his motorbike. And I think he must have gone back and said that I was part of this protest, and as a journalist should have been objective and not participated. I should have watched. I should have been a bystander. I should have written about it. But it was my weekend off, and I was a South African. Anyway, I spoke to the news editor that Sunday, or Saturday or Sunday, and the front page photograph was of the picture I took with my Instamatic camera. But the Monday morning, the editor called me in and sort of reprimanded me for being on the beach and said to me, well, what's going to happen? You have to be objective. You can't participate in a protest because what will happen if these people take over one day? And I said, well, if these people take over and do the same thing, I'll do the same thing. But what annoyed me most was I had worked at that newspaper for a very long time, and he had just been brought in as the editor after the editor I really liked very much, Tony Hurd, had been fired for printing an interview with Oliver Tambo, who was banned at the time. And I realized that he had no idea that the photograph on the front page of his newspaper was mine. And he was this editor telling me, because he was much older than me, this old white guy in an office full of pictures of old white guys, like, what was I doing there? And I just got angry and said, don't patronize me. Don't do this to me. And it was quite nice to be able to do that at that point. I was really angry at being called in for doing my job. And that's when I sort of realized that there were other interests at heart in the newspaper itself, that there was this sham that we were going to tell both sides of the story. But actually, that wasn't the case. And then I left shortly after that because I just thought, not that I was better than it or morally more superior, but I was just, no.
Are there lessons that readers can take away after reading about your life?
I don't know. Hey, that you can, that everything, that life is just a series of problems to be resolved, and that which hurts us can come to heal us in the long run, and that we can live with, I think, hurts or misunderstandings, particularly interpersonal ones, for a very long time. But actually, that's not worth it, and that you should try and make the life you can while you can. Don't wait for someone else to do it, and that you are obliged to care about fellow human beings and make a difference and change life. Don't just think someone else is going to do that. So I don't know. And if you think something's wrong, eventually write a book and prove that you were right.
That was author and journalist Marianne Thamm discussing her book Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me.